In this class, we will learn about the changing pattern of age structure. We have already learned what is an age structure, what is an age structure transition, and also even how to measure an age structure of a population. So, then what is the changing pattern of age structure means? This class primarily we will look at once again the age structure transition and then take an example of a country, and in our case it is India, and then see in deep how age structure transition is shaping the country's economy and as well as how this transition is happening within the demographic transition process in the country. So, primarily this module, the emphasis will be on India. We will basically look at first the age structure transition and look at the demographic transition in India, which is the vital indicator of the age structure transition, and then specifically get into the India's age structure transition and how actually it will have an impact in the coming years. So, let us first start with whatever we have learned already, that is the age structure transition. We have already learned that there are three determinants of the age structure transition: the fertility, the mortality, and the migration. It determines the age structure of a population in any geographical areas, whether it is in a small place like a village or a district, or a bigger place like in a state or a country or a group of countries or even the globe as such. So, the changing pattern of age structure is, as we have already learned, is known as age structural transition, which is often referred as AST. AST is the process of shifting age structure from young to the old age group population over a period of time. During this transition process, we have also learned that there is something known as the second stage of transition, which is generally known as the demographic dividend or demographic gift or demographic bonus, and many times it is referred as the window of opportunity, meaning for every nation, for every society, there is an opportunity, and that opportunity is basically primarily because of the demographic transition or demographic factors. The opportunity is for the economic development. So, demographic factors contribute or give an opportunity for the economic development. This decline in the younger age group population and increase in the working age population creates this opportunity, and many nations can realize it if there are conducive environment. We have also already learned the stages of age structure transition, that there are three stages of the transition. The first stage is a predominant feature of young dependency ratio, meaning large proportion of the population will be in the younger age group, primarily less than 15 years of age. And the second stage, there is a bulge in the age structure of the population, that is a bulge in the working age group age structure of the population. So, which creates an opportunity for the country, because a large proportion of the people in that country will be working or are able to contribute to the labor market and able to contribute to the economy. And the third stage, there is an increasing proportion of elderly, meaning there is a high old age dependency ratio, which creates its own implications for the economy and society. So, let us look at the age structure transition and the demographic transition linkages, because in order to understand the age structure transition or population age structure, we need to have a deep understanding of the demographic transition process, and particularly demographic transition process in the past. And if you want to understand the future of the age structure, we should also know the current and the future demographic transition process. Demographic transition is primarily the linkages between fertility and mortality, and perhaps which also signifies for the age structure the migration pattern. So, it is so important, it is vital for anyone to understand the process of demographic transition if we have to know what is the age structure we are likely to experience today and even for the coming years. As the fertility decline is the major reason for the age structure transition, it is important that we understand the process of demographic transition first, the fertility process of the demographic transition. As all of you know, the demographic transition is a process of shifting of fertility and mortality from its high level to a lower level over a period of time. That is, in the past there has been stages of very high fertility and very high mortality, but in such cases the population growth also will be almost zero or negligible. But the later stages, first the mortality transition takes place, mortality start declining, and the fertility perhaps may not respond very immediately to the mortality transition. Naturally, there will be a wide gap between fertility and mortality in the second part of the transition, which ultimately lead to rapid population growth. And later, the fertility also respond to the mortality transition, and the fertility also start declining, which ultimately lead to what is known as a change in the age structure. And finally, when the fertility and mortality remains at the lower level, you would also see a third stages of the age structure transition. So, it means demographic transition has different stages, from one stage which is from high fertility and high mortality, another stage of declining mortality and high fertility, and another stage declining mortality and early decline in the fertility, and later stage low mortality and rapid decline in fertility, and finally perhaps even low mortality and low fertility, and even sometimes the fertility is even lower than mortality. So, moving from one stage to the another in the demographic transition also signifies different stages of the economy, different stages of society, and different stages even in the age structure transition. So, let us also learn something on the demographic transition in India, which will give us a good understanding of the age structure transition happening in India. Firstly, the evidence show that India is following a pattern of demographic transition currently, but with a late beginning and a slower pace initially. Firstly, in India, the death rate began to fall perhaps somewhere in the 1920s, but the birth rate remained high during those periods. So, we have a situation from 1920, the death rate has been declining faster and the birth rate remaining high near about 1960s, which means opening up the gap between the fertility and mortality, resulting in rapid population growth. The gap seems to have narrowed in the last few decades because the fertility also started declining faster during the last few decades. Fourthly, India also currently has moved from a middle to the late transitional stage in terms of demographic transition, meaning India's mortality is relatively low and India's fertility transition is relatively rapid. So, naturally India is inching towards a rapid demographic transition and closer to a replacement level fertility and also a low mortality situation. India's population growth has increased from somewhere around 238 million in 1901, 1210 million in 2011. So, last century in India, 20th century in India, when the mortality started declining, the fertility remaining relatively high, it was a period of rapid population growth in the country. The population has doubled several times in the country. If you look at the pace was slow up to 1921, because the population growth till 1921 in India has been relatively at a very slow pace, with some decline in the population in 1911 and 21 due to a major influenza taken place in the country. But later the population growth picked up, and from 1921 you would see an accelerated population growth, and which was further accelerated to something around 20% per a decade from 1951 onwards. So, if you look at during the period 1961 to 91, India's population growth was 20% per decade and 2% per annum. The annual growth rate of population have declined marginally in the last decade or so, and which implies that there is also a decline in the fertility which is happening in the country. The latest census 2011 has shown a clear fall in the decadal growth rate of the population from to 17.6%. So, it is below 2% currently. The crude death rate, which was relatively very high in the early period of the 20th century, was 40 per 1000 during the early years and has declined consistently, fell steadily from 1920s, below 30 in 40s and further in 20s in 1960s and below 10 in recent few decades now. As a result, the life expectancy in India has increased, was as low as 20 in the 1911-20 period, and it was become in the 30s in 1931 to 40 and crossed 40 during the period 1951 to 60, and later in 1970s and 60s it has gone up and it has become in the 60s in the 1990s, and further it is towards the late 60s now at present. The female life expectancy was below male life expectancy during the most part of the last century, but that has also now become favorable to females in the recent times. The fertility transition also shows a similar pattern in the sense that the urban areas in India had a lower fertility compared to rural areas, and educated and the rich had lower fertility compared to the poor. A steady fall in fertility was observed perhaps since the 1970s, but a faster decline since the middle of 1980s. Currently, India's total fertility rate, that is the average number of children a woman have in her reproductive period, comes to around 2.3 in 2015 based on the latest estimates. The late 1970s and mid 1980s, the decline has been fairly smooth but slow and became faster after 1980s. Overall, as we have pointed out, India is in the advanced stages of fertility transition, closer to the replacement level of fertility, despite the fact that there is considerable regional variation in the country. Let us look at some of these data which we have depicted or presented now. Look at the life expectancy in India. Graph shows both male and female life expectancy. As we told, the female life expectancy was in between lower than the male life expectancy, but at present the female life expectancy is higher than male life expectancy. the life expectancy of both the sexes in India is inching towards the 70 mark, which perhaps would be achieved in the coming decades. This is the depiction of the crude birth rate and crude death rate in India. The difference between these two shows the population growth or natural growth rate in the country. If you could see that in the 20s, the crude birth rate and crude death rate in the country has been nearly equal, and the population growth in such situation would have been nearly 0. But the gap widened with the decline in the mortality and rapid decline in mortality since the 20s and perhaps later after 40s, and the fertility has been on the other hand declining much slower pace than the mortality. So, the birth rate, but in recent years started declining faster, and the gap currently started slowly narrowing. Similarly, the total fertility rate in the country, if you look at the country, as we have already noted, has reached a total fertility rate of 2.3 children per woman, meaning a country or any place needs 2.1 children as the replacement level fertility, that is 2 parents replacing 2 children. So, India that way is very close to the replacement level of fertility of 2.1. So, it is expected that the country will soon reach the replacement level fertility of 2.1. As we pointed out, the fertility, the mortality and to some extent migration, but for the country as a whole in India, the international migration does not signify a very significant proportion of the population. So, the major part of the age structure in India, if you consider the country as a whole, is due to the forces of fertility and mortality. So, now we will look at India's age structure, what is happening. This is India's age structure, which is in the 1950s. This population pyramid or the age sex pyramid shows the typically high fertility or the stage 1 of the age structure transition, AST. What does it mean? The large proportion of people are born in each year. So, always the younger, the bottom part of the line will be much higher than the later part. So, creating a typically triangle shape of the age structure in India. And we could also look at the sex differences as well, but more importantly in this lesson we will concentrate on the overall age structure. But it has slowly started changing. If you look at 2000, there has been some shift in the shape of that curve, shape of that pyramid, but not very rapid, because the current age structure is the result not only of the current fertility, but of the past fertility. So, the 2000 year age structure is also the result of much earlier fertility rate. So, with the earlier the fertility rate was been higher. So, naturally it shows a slightly slowing down pattern, but not significantly different. If we look at in 2010, we will see that India's age structure is now changing in the sense that the addition to the younger age group population is relatively less and less, but because of the fast high fertility, we also see a shape of the curve which is adult bulging. That is, there is large proportion of people who are in the working age group population in India currently. That is typically because of lower and lower number of people are born in the younger ages. If you see the 2011 census in India, the number of people born in the 0 to 6 age group, that is the youngest age group, younger age groups, which is usually known as child age group, is lower than the number of people born during 2001 census, indicating that the number of children added to the labor force, the population is lower than the previous decades. So, if it depicts the entire graph, try to depict the entire one, you would see a shape of this nature. See the red one, which is 1950, the second, the green, which is 2000, and the white, which is 2010. We can easily discern the difference in these age pyramids. So, age pyramid, which is typically because of the age structure transition, is also changing in the country. So, we will also look at the composition of the population by broad age group in India in 2011. That is the latest census available in India. So, the age sex structure data in the country primarily and mainly come from the census, decadal census, which is being conducted by the Ministry of Home Affairs, Office of the Registrar General of India. According to 2011 census data, population census data, we have around 31% of the population in the 0 to 14 age group and 15 to 59 age group, which is in India it is generally considered as the working age group. Around 60.5% of the population are currently surviving, and there are somewhere around 8.5% of the population in the older ages. What does it mean? It means that bulk of the age group population in India are in the adult age group. Bulk of the population in India are in the adult age groups of 15 to 59, and the proportion of population in the younger age group, that is child age group, 0 to 14 age group, is declined from somewhere in the 40s to 30s, and the elderly, which represents 60 plus population, has slightly gone up, but it is only 1 or 2 percentage points. So, look at the trend or the future trend which is going to happen, we would definitely see that there is a decline in the younger age group population, which is going to be rapid, an increase in the elderly, which will be rapid in later years, later decades, and a slight increase in the working age group population, also a few more years or few more decades, and then a flattening of the working age group population and perhaps a slight decline thereafter. So, why age structure is so important? As we have pointed out, age structure of the population has important significance to the economic growth of that country. This is known as demographic dividend. It is widely talked about for many contexts, and there are many writers who believe that India has a demographic opportunity, that because India is an young country with large proportion of people in the younger age group, India has the ability to take advantage of this age group population to take the country to higher economic growth and economic development heights. The decline in the younger age group population definitely created this situation, as we have already seen through age pyramid, and you would see that there is an opportunity existing in India because of that. But whether the country is able to take advantage of this, as we have already pointed out, it is the result of various other factors. Factors, you need a high human capital potential, you need a knowledge economy, you need a good saving and investment climate, you need political stability, and many other conducive factors to take advantage of this demographic dividend. There are several concerns of the demographic dividend in India, because it is often told that India's human capital development or the educational status of the people is still relatively poor. Also, there are other issues like labor market issues, lack of employment opportunities, etc., which can actually lead to demographic dividend into more of a demographic disaster. Therefore, India need to really work on the other conducive forces to create an enabling environment to take advantage of the demographic opportunity. As we have pointed out, India's age structure transition is a process, so that is not an end. So naturally, a high bulge in the working age group will not last long. Ultimately, population aging is likely to take place due to age structure transition. That is a process whereby the proportion of people in the older age group will be going up. So, it is primarily because of the rapid decline in fertility and also moving of the cohort to the older ages which was born earlier, also due to increased life expectancy. The large proportion of elderly has also several other implications for the society. If you look at the table, the older ages, if you consider even 65 plus, which will be something around 21% in India by 2050. So, if you consider even the oldest age group 80 plus, it is going up from less than 1% in 1950 to something around 3% in 2050. There will be a rapid change which is likely to take place even in the older ages in India in the coming years. So, India need to be prepared not only of the current of the bulge in the working age group population, but the emanating challenges of the aging or elderly population in the country, both in terms of their health care, both in terms of their social security measures, in terms of their living arrangement pattern, and so on and so forth. So, let us summarize what we learned in this lesson. We have seen that there is a changing pattern of age structure happening primarily because of the demographic transition taking place. We have intensively looked at, in India's context, what is the demographic transition happening, how the demographic transition in India, the process of demographic transition in India happened over the last century or more. We have also seen how the mortality transition has been faster and fertility later followed, and we are inching towards later stages of the transition. And we also looked at the impact of such transition on the age structure of the population, both in terms of the demographic dividend opportunity which exists in India currently, and also the likely old age scenario which is likely to take place in the future. So, this gives you an idea about what will happen due to demographic changes, what will happen due to age structure transition to the economy and society due to changes taking place in terms of demographic dividend and later higher proportion of elderly population. Thank you.